Thanks for having me. I appreciate it and getting a chance to talk here. I want to thank Bill Deeks for making that phone call saying, hey, if you've got time, 3 months ago. And of course, I wasn't thinking when I said yes, but I do appreciate it. It's good to see the activity out here with this conference. Well done and glad to see it growing. Tom talked about some of the stuff that I've been involved with, and I've been very fortunate to get to this point where I'm with LyondellBasell right now, and I can talk about what's going to impact our business as well as the industry here for the next, well, we think for the foreseeable future. So with that, we'll talk regional feedstocks, NGLs, and the other speakers have talked about this as well, but I guess one of the conversations I had out here, yes, it may seem a little redundant. There may be some things that I doubt if there's much conflict between what we're saying and where we're going with this discussion on this fundamental advantage feedstock. But the other side of it is, well, do we have to hear so much of it? And I think that's going to be, it's almost like how do you ignore, you know, the elephant in the room? And it is a real significant advantage here for the industry, and so we need to talk about it and also maybe set what does the future and the landscape look like going forward. Look, you've heard of it, you know, I wasn't here for the first two presentations, so I'm not going to belabor what the other guy said. Otherwise, this probably might be a 5-minute discussion. But clearly, we are in an advantaged position, advantaged globally, relative to crude, naphtha-based polymers. And so we like that position, and we believe right now that that is a game-changing moment for us as far as the industry goes. Crude oil to gas ratios are very important. That's what creates the advantage. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where those intersect. We do think we've got an advantage position from North America. This is not a U.S. phenomenon. This is a North American phenomenon, predominantly between the United States and Canada, but naturally Mexico will benefit as well. And it's going to create an environment for us as we go forward where, and I recollect, I've been in the industry long enough where we're coming up to 29 years. It's hard to believe. It just seems like things flash by so fast. But I do remember back in the late 90s, when really what we thought was going to be the last cracker being built in North America was being put in place, and BASF was involved in that, and many of us just sat there shaking our head going, we're never going to be able to compete with Asia on naphtha, and we're never for sure going to be able to compete with the Middle East. And that would be the last cracker. And I think that general thought did progress for many, many years going into 2005, 2006. And then subsequently, it's amazing how the world turns. And so now we see a great opportunity on a North American play, which will help not only level the playing field, I think it'll be an advantage playing field for like I said, for the next 5 to 10 years. And if you look at the region, why is this important and why does it impact predominantly North America? North America, of course, we've got a huge position. We have been an exporter, not of ethylene, but of the derivative products. But we're a large producer of ethylene here. You can see Northeast Asia, North America, Middle East, and Western Europe. And between Western Europe and Northeast Asia, they are predominantly cracking naphtha. So they're on a different cost basis than what we'd be here in North America, where most of our crackers here, 80+%, are on an NGL basis. So we've got a lower cost advantage position. So as long as naphtha remains the predominant feedstock in that part of the world, it's going to, and you have the price differential between the two products on an equivalent ethylene pound basis, we will remain advantaged here in North America. And what you see here on this chart, if you look at the left-hand side, I think the point we would look at is that ethane being in the light blue side, it's growing. We really have been light crackers here in North America for a while. Naphtha has had its place and, in fact, was in parity for many years here in the 2000s with ethane, in some cases advantaged. So you really had a parity. It was bouncing back and forth, and then that's changed. Because if you look at ethane now, it's moving from a 50% of the feed stream to where now you're going north of 77%. And on NGL streams, when you start adding in the propane, then you're upward close to 90% of your feed stream being light, competing with potentially about 85% of the feed in your Asian crackers based on naphtha. Ironically, you can see the yields stream on the right. Overall, when you look at a barrel for example, and we'll talk about NGLs here coming up too, but your yield differential between the two bases is fairly significant. And when you've got a low cost basis, it sure does magnify the advantage. This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. This is the midstream section. When we're talking about upstream, obviously those are the folks that are finding and punching holes in the ground and actually developing the shale gas or the crude oil, either one. And in this case, in North America, they're chasing after both. So you've got, and that's not on this chart. That would be off to the left. That would be considered the upstream. You've got the midstream right here, which includes the gas processing plant, all the way to the point where you're putting in the pipeline a finished product that will go to either a refinery or a petrochemical facility. The refinery and the petrochemical facility, also not on this chart, would be to the right. That's the downstream. So you got downstream, this is the midstream, and you have upstream. The midstream folks here play a critical part in bringing both of those entities together. In other words, they bring the product to market. And they bring it at a point where it's a fungible, sellable, usable product. You've got people like Enterprise, Targa, DCP, I mean, the list goes on of people in this midstream space and who have been able to really carve out a key infrastructure niche. The point I would make on this chart is nothing really happens if you've got all the shale gas on the upstream side, you've got the technology to get it out of the ground, but if you don't have the capability to get it to the market, you're not able to take advantage of the advantage you've got. So we look at this as being critical in our ability to bring low-cost shale gas products, natural gas liquids, to market so that we, as the petrochemical industry, or in the refining segment, which is using some of these streams as well, can take advantage of this position and leverage it globally. Now, we'll tell you that as good as shale gas is, and we think it is a wonderful position to be in, as good as it is, this key function here is critical to the future growth. Because if you're not adding the infrastructure, the wellhead, all the way to the petrochemical plant, this can all come to a screeching halt. So if you're not building gas plants, if you're not putting the pipeline systems in place for the Y-grade, if you're not building the fracs, if you're not building the propane export capability, if you're not building the pipelines to get to all the various petrochemical facilities to connect to, if that doesn't happen, then at that point, that'll turn into the bottleneck in being able to achieve the full advantage that's out there in the marketplace. Some of those that you do or don't know, and like I said, these previous presentations, I don't know how well they were covered on it, but just so you know, from an upstream standpoint, we really knew the shale gas was out there. That's been out there. This is not a new phenomenon that everyone's found out about, that, oh my gosh, we found a new reserve and it's got X amount of billion barrels or X amount of TCF of reserves in there. That is not the case. We knew it was out there. It was just our ability to get it out of the ground. That's the key. That's the difference. Directional drilling has come into play. Hydraulic fracturing has come into play. All those things together have allowed the technology to advance to the point to access reserves that before we could not get a hold of cost efficiently. You can always get a hold of reserves, but can you do it cost efficiently? And this just highlights really the spread that you see when you look at between light naphtha, again, what most of Asia is cracking on one side, and Europe, by the way, and showing also on the ethane and propane. It's a significant price differential that you will see. We've seen the crude to gas ratio. Typically, it used to be considered Europe parity when the natural gas price relative to a WTI, well, actually it's Brent now, which has really turned into the standard, to a Brent crude price, you would say you're at parity about 7 to 1. As co-product value started to increase, the general assumption was that, okay, maybe it's probably more like 10 to 1 you're at parity. But now you can see crude to gas ratios well in excess of 30 to 1, in some cases 40 to 1. When you've got natural gas that as of today is probably NYMEX sitting at about 350, and it's probably sitting at that just because we've had a couple cold bursts up in the Midwest, but been hovering in the low threes, so 350 today. and you still got Brent probably hovering around $110 a barrel. And so, and do the math on the crude ratios, and it's a fairly compelling story as far as the cost differential between, for petrochemical folks on those two bases. This is the part that's really more powerful, and what we look at as both as an industry and as a company. Where are you on the cost curve? Are you going to be able to compete globally, or are you going to be a regional provider? And if you're a regional provider, are you at risk from imports because somebody else may be in a better spot on the cost curve? We've got two lines up here. The dotted line shows you 2004. It's kind of that period I was telling you about where naphtha and ethane were somewhat in parity at that time, bouncing around. And then you've got the solid line, which is really capturing 2011, for example. And I think the big story on here, as you look at it, you look at Western Europe, which is the purple triangle on here. You look at Western Europe, where they were in 2004, not a bad position. In fact, probably a little bit better off than we were here in North America. And look how far they've pushed out on the cost curve. Also notice the flatness of the curve in 2004. Because the products were fairly close to parity, you would see a fairly flat curve, with the exception the dips down at the very bottom versus the tail at the top, probably scale differential between the two outliers. The really, really cost competitive guy and the really, really high cost guy. But everybody else in between, it's a fairly flat line. That's changed immensely all of a sudden now, depending on what you're cracking and where you're at. And you can see the slope on this gets very extreme, and what you find is the Middle East is pushed out a little bit, but still, they're the leader when it comes to cost position and advantage. And then you've got North America now has moved into the number 2 spot, and it's really closed the gap. And ironically, as you see a North American industry that's focusing more and more on cost reduction, this is outside of feedstock. Feedstock aside, adjust for feedstock, we have a mature industry that still has an export basis here, our export position, albeit, you know, that's not the dominant piece, but will soon be. But you've had cost focus. Everybody's focused on cost. We have to move up with what we control. We don't control feedstock, but we do control what's inside the fence to move up the curve. Middle East is struggling trying to contain costs. So you've really got two areas that are going in different directions on their overall fixed cost structure. Now, it's going to take a while. Let's face it, the 90% story on your cost is variable. It's your feedstock, okay? So what's going to move the needle? It's your feedstock. But still, at the end of the day, you need to be able to control and manage your cost structure. China, as many of you here, China, you have more folks in a plant and a rapidly escalating cost of living that's just inflation that's moving up. And to keep employees and quality employees, you're having to pay more. They're not at the same point on parity and ratios as the Middle East and North America, but you see those all migrating closer and closer together. Over the years, you're going to see it really become at parity in some ways. But that's down the road, and again, that's not a major needle mover. It's the feedstock. And like I said, it's really literally all the cards were kind of in the deck, and he just threw them all up in the air and said, okay, 2004 is over. Where do they lay in 2011? The landscape's changed. And we believe structurally has changed. Okay, now this is a story that I want to highlight for North America, but the part I think I want to cover that is a little more meaningful is this is a great play. The Braskem, I just caught the tail end of his, and I think he did a nice job with covering some of the opportunities that are out here, but this is really a great, great story. From a gas production standpoint, along with how rich and how wet the natural gas is, and it's prolific, extremely prolific. We are an environment where, one, we've got the technology. Number two, we've got the capability within where these locations are, with the exception of the Marcellus. Let's face it, if you're up in the Bakken or you're in the Eagle Ford, you're in the Barnett, there aren't a lot of people in those areas. You go up into Western Canada, not a lot of people. And so you really are in a position where you can lay down pipe, you can get out in the field, you can get access to these reserves. It'll be a little more challenge as you get up into places, like I said, Pennsylvania, parts of Ohio, with the Utica in there, with Marcellus and New York, a little more challenge in those areas. And of course, regulatory concerns are out there with people that have concerns over fracturing. But I think those two, people will find a way that there's a great history for this as far as doing it safely, doing it successfully, and doing it in an environmentally acceptable fashion. We've got a tremendous playground right now in North America to take advantage of, and this is why we think it's going to be structurally a change for a long period of time. Now, what happens though? As the discussion went earlier, shale gas is not a U.S. phenomenon. It is not. The good news is we're in a low-risk environment here in North America, very low risk. We're not sending people out to the frontier. We're not sending you off to a place where, you know, they got to helicopter you in. We got to have security forces to go do this. No. We're in a low-risk environment where we've got natural resources and we have the technology. And the technology leaders are sitting here right in this country. So that combination has really accelerated this growth. It's been phenomenal, almost to the point where it's accelerated it so fast, supply is exceeding demand, and you see that in the pricing structure. But it really is a great story. I mean, it's a phenomenal story. I mean, you look at it, that it's in our backyard, we've known it's here. A huge play I would talk about is up in Western Canada. That's got, the Montney is a very rich, NGL-rich area. And that's probably one of the things that has been the biggest surprise, is not that the natural gas was there, but how rich it was. And typically, most of these plays, even in the Eagle Ford, you'll find fairly well-defined areas where there's dry gas, and then there's this one big cut right down the middle that's got a tremendous amount of NGLs in there, which from our business, that's what we care about. So anyway, as you can see, North America is well-positioned on this, and there's plenty of opportunity, and most of this hasn't even been exploited yet. And then you've got the rest of the world. We do believe at a point here that technology, because it is very transferable and it's very transportable, and you do see, for example, I just read today where Sinopec is going to be buying about $1 billion worth of assets from Chesapeake. You have access to the technology. They're buying the play here in North America, so they've got access to the technology to take back to China. Yes, it's nice to be here. You get your footprint. It's wonderful. And we have other people that are looking at the same thing. CNOC's done it. You saw where CNOC tried to make the Unocal run, and now they're up in Canada. So people are doing that because they need access to the technology. And once that happens, you'll be able to take it to places like Argentina. You'll take it to places like, again, in Africa, North Africa, there's still an abundance, looks like, of shale gas there, and China. So I think the playing field's going to level, but we are years away before you see the rest of the world catching up to North America. But I think it'd be very myopic, and we'd be putting our head in the sand to think that that won't happen. And don't underestimate the pace of change. Where there's value, there's a way to find it and make it happen and execute. Now, the part, though, is, okay, in my sphere, my space and universities, you've got propane and ethane. We like them both because I can make a very low-cost ethylene product from it. And ethylene, you're typically not exporting ethylene, but what you are exporting are the derivatives. So I want to talk a little bit about is that when we've got ethylene and derivatives out there, there's really a couple key drivers. Polyethylene is one, and you can see it's well over 50%, 60% of what we've got of the ethylene is being consumed into polyethylene. You've got ethylene oxide, and you've got EDC. And so there's some other small derivatives that you can go into with ethylene, but for the most part, you can re-inject a little bit into the gas stream, into the natural gas stream, and it can get burned in some sort of, for heating values somewhere, but very little of that can go in there. So for the most part, you're putting this into a polymer of some sort. And this is really polymer or liquid if it's ethylene glycol. But effectively, this is where we meet the global market. This is really the intersection of derivatives. Until you put ethylene into a derivative, that's when the world of $110 Brent and $350 gas collide. And that's where the advantage comes into play. If you can't get this on a boat, can't get it cost efficiently to a location somewhere around the world, there is no competitive advantage. This is how it turns into competitive advantage. So it shows up in the polymers or some key derivative liquids that are able to cost effectively reach out to most countries in the world and displace high cost pounds from other regions of the world. If you look at exports, so the issue is, can we be a predominantly export country? Well, we were back in the 60s and 70s and in part of the 80s, and then the world caught up. People started building crackers in the Middle East. People started building things in Asia. Let's get close to the market. We're not advantaged from a feedstock. So it was strictly a move where we were a heavy exporter, and that's been diminishing over time for a variety of different reasons, whether it's labor costs, whether it's associated with technology, whether it's associated with feedstock. Well, can we get to a point, if you look at 1990, where 16% of our polyethylene capacity was being exported? Can we get back to a point where we're shipping a lot more? And by the way, prior to 1990, there were higher exports than that, significantly higher in the early 80s as far as exports. Well, it started to plateau down. It moderated a little bit in 2000, came up just a tad at that point because the overall economy was in pretty good shape and getting some traction. In 2010, you had a recovery from the 2008 period. So what you're seeing now, though, is can it continue at this pace and go higher? Yes, we believe it can. We believe there are still marginal producers around the world who cannot compete and meet the demand in certain parts of the world, namely Asia, that cannot compete and that we're cost advantage here, and these export pounds will force out those high-cost export pounds. Now, again, if China develops its shale gas and develops its own infrastructure, own plants, own petrochemical, larger and more cost-advantaged petrochemical industry, yeah, they can do that, but it's going to take time. And at that point, you may see a little bit more pressure on the ability to export from here. But from a cost basis and where we stand now, there's no reason why the Middle East will be the first guy at the table as far as supplying material. He'll be the first guy. And then right behind that will be North America. And so we do expect to see, again, high-cost producers will have to give way and let the advantage position come through. When you look at trade flows, this is what tells you why this is the case and why we think we can do this. If you look at Northeast Asia, they're at a deficit when you look out in 2020 timeframe. They still need, it's a good growth business, good growth region. The per capita consumption per person is still well below the rest of the more developed part of the world. And so what you'll see is that that number will continue to grow. And it's not only just from an export platform, it's from also an internal growth area of that part of the world. Let's face it, that middle class is growing bigger and bigger. Disposable and discretionary income is increasing. People want to have a car and maybe two. They've got to take care of their families. They want to have do things to their house, buy a new house. All those things that right now have fueled internal demand coupled with the ability to export to various places around the world. So we do think there's going to be a continued robust market in that region. Middle East, as you can see, they're going to be in a net position where they don't have as much internal demand, so they're going to be exporting. And then North America, we see that as well. And again, the two greens, Middle East and North America, will be the two folks who will be supporting really that incremental growth in demand in Western Europe, South America, and Northeast Asia. Okay, what does this mean for us, and what does it mean for an SPE conference? I mean, maybe that's another way to look at it. It's been positioned well, and I think as we look at this business, there's a couple things that are going to happen. You've got or likely to happen, you've got a well-advantaged position, so you've got a low energy basis, so you've got nat gas and you've got the NGL stream. Nat gas is a good thing for everybody. If you're heating your house and you're living up in the Midwest, and I think pricing at Chicago Gate's about $3.70 per MMBTU, you are probably pretty happy because that just means more money that's going to go for something else. Granted, it may go to the petrol you're putting in your car, or it may going into the new car you got to buy your son that's graduating from college. But you will have more discretionary income to spend somewhere else outside of putting it in to heat your house. So that's just the homeowner. Now think about industry. We have a lot of industries either you're part of or work with or customers of yours that are very energy intensive. So we have a lot of manufacturing that is still in this country that is now getting a renaissance of its own, where instead of spending, I know in a styrene plant, you could easily be spending somewhere around $70 to $80 million a year in natural gas. And one plant, $70 to $80 million a year. And that was based on $5 to $6 gas. Just think if it's $3.20. So that's more money you can reinvest to other parts of that plant or back to your shareholders. Pick your poison. So I think overall, you're going to see a couple things are going to happen. One, you've got advantage feedstock, and you've got a lower variable operating cost associated with having cheaper natural gas. That should be an incentive for people that our customers who we supply, look, we still believe that there's going to be good, solid North American demand for polymers. So that's our focus. That's where we want to spend our time. I would tell you that it just doesn't even feel comfortable, even though it makes a lot of sense, the math does, to just build an export platform facility. It doesn't for us. I'd like to know that I've got a good portion of that site. If I build a brand new cracker, or I build a new polyethylene unit, or I build a new EG unit, that I've got a home for it here. And oh, by the way, I'll flywheel maybe somewhere between 20 to 40% of that for export. And have that ability. But I need a domestic market to underpin it, because even though we may be advantaged, the markets go through periods of time where they self-correct and then they open back up again. The world is not linear in our business, never is. The chemistry may be, but the supply-demand profile is not. It is not linear. So what happens is the markets do tend to spigot on and off. And we've seen that before in Asia, where even though demand was good and prices were rapidly rising in Asia, they quit buying. And they quit buying because the price was too high. So if we quit buying, they've got to do something with this product, and that product on the water coming across now is stranded product. So we've seen that happen, and that could happen again. But overall, that's not sustainable, but it can happen. So our world is, we think we can have a domestic base with a nice position and a good export window to ship other places around the world. Now with that domestic base, we think there's a tremendous opportunity for people that have outsourced and gone to different parts of the world and looking for a lower cost place to go ahead and re-import back to North America. We do think that if I were going to be setting up shop in a low natural gas environment coupled with having suppliers here that have an advantage position, this may be a longer-term reinvestment as you're looking for your next growth opportunities over the next 3 to 10 years. And we've already had customers inquiring to us about expansions, where they were going to spend the dollar and go outsource somewhere else or set up shop somewhere maybe in India. Now they're looking at, why don't we just go ahead and do that here in North America? So it's been interesting, the level of discussions there, and especially on the automotive supplier side. We've seen much more on that. So does this mean a renaissance for North American industrial-based manufacturers? I'm not going to be that ambitious to say that, but I do think now, whereas 5 years ago, where do I put my next dollar? No one thought about putting it here. Now that's a different decision. I think it's a much harder decision, and I think you're going to find more of those dollars will end up here, and you'll still have some that truly are trying to create more of a global supply chain base. Different drivers. But nonetheless, I think this market here is going to be catching some of the benefit of having this advantaged shale gas position. Overall, with that, you'll come U.S. investment, and with it will come employment. And I think those things naturally are going to come with it. I think the big challenge we're going to have, and I'm going to go off script a little bit, and that's probably what you're not supposed to do, is that you've got a bunch of crackers that look like they're going to get built here over the next 5 years. And by, say, a bunch of crackers, there's at least 5 that are announced. You've got one even up in the Pennsylvania area with Shell. You've got several down here on the Gulf Coast. You've got people that are debottlenecking. I think the big risk that we run as an industry is not what happens when they're all built, it's getting them built. What we find is that the industry, when you're in an industry, when somebody says, well, we're never going to build another cracker again after 1999, we're never going to build another one, oh, everything's going to be built in the Middle East, you'd be surprised how many people no longer want to be pipe fitters, how many people don't want to be welders anymore. How many people don't want, and you start changing your work pool, your demographic work pool, because you have people that say, well, why would I want to go into that industry when it's just a hanging on industry and not one that's growing and dynamic? That'll be the biggest challenge we have, not only ourselves as we're expanding our facilities, but our competition as well, with regard to having the engineering talent, the technical talent, as well as the labor pool to actually physically go out and construct these sites. We're already seeing where it's very competitive. Wage rates are getting bid up rather quickly. And I think machine shops, a lot of machine shops have decided to leave and go to other parts around the world, which is very typical. And those shops are getting busy because there's not as many of them here in North America, and you're having to go to Korea, again to Japan, go to Italy. And so what you're seeing is the amount of time it takes to get your exchangers in, your compressors in, and so forth, that time is getting more accelerated. So I think what you're going to have is this next 5-year period is going to be a scramble, making sure you have qualified technical support coupled with machine shop time and fab time and labor to go ahead and construct these facilities. And I think you will see a real push on meeting some of these schedules to get these crackers in place. They will happen, and I think that's the good news. We'll find a way to make them happen, but we may be in a rather inflationary environment in this particular segment of the business as getting the resources and paying for the resources. But in many ways, I guess you could look at it, it's a good problem to have. So I'm optimistic that things do look bright. Some of these projects may get pushed, some may not actually happen, but for the most part, we're doing things now, and it looks like there are enough of these crackers coming on stream, which it does kind of warm your heart a little bit that an industry that people thought was gone and kind of dead and was going to hang on is now reinvigorated back to a position where really the rest of the world are looking at this as the new Middle East. It's not quite the new Middle East, but I will tell you, it's pretty darn good. So with that, I appreciate your time. Thank you.